I'm on to you!
Now, for any fans of the Resident Evil franchise, this moment solidified that yes, Resident Evil was back. In 2017, Resident Evil 7 Biohazard came out, and boy howdy, it shocked everybody who was a fan of this franchise previously. If you're familiar with the Resident Evil franchise, RE6 was kind of fallen off and people were losing a lot of confidence, and then suddenly Resident Evil 7 comes out. It's widely received as one of the best survival horror games that is currently out there, and everyone is just wowed at this return to form that Resident Evil 7 was. And while it's easy to say that Resident Evil 7 was a key pivotal turning point for the franchise, I actually am going to make the argument today that Resident Evil 7 was key to Capcom's overall strategy and is thus explaining why Capcom is kind of really killing it in the games market right now. What's up everybody, my name is Marks, and strap in because now we're going to talk about how Resident Evil 7 saved Capcom. Resident Evil was one of those franchises that started out early in the 90s, and it really peaked at Resident Evil 4-ish time, and then we just saw this change in how the whole thing was kind of going, and it really just started to fall off by Resident Evil 6. But as time went on, we started to see that, generally speaking, the games were not as well liked anymore because they really had changed direction with how they wanted to go. Resident Evil 6 had a pretty low Metacritic score, only averaging to be about in that high 60s range, and generally speaking amongst the fandom, was kind of a joke compared to a lot of the previous games. It felt like the game was weighed down by so much history, so much lore, and on top of that too, it wasn't really a horror game anymore that you had to worry about, solving puzzles or escaping these dangerous situations, because it just turned into an action game, for lack of better terms, with a lot of co-op. It felt like the franchise was getting stuck into this trap where, they had to keep on one-upping themselves based on the previous one and sending in like so many crazy twists, so many action sequences and spectacles in that sense, that it didn't feel like the Resident Evil soul still was a part of the franchise anymore. But then, Resident Evil 7 releases a demo called Beginning Hour in 2016, and this was a stark change in how the whole franchise was going to go. It swapped the game to a first-person perspective, focused on survival horror in a lot more confined spaces, and it really just went back to the roots of what Resident Evil was. Of course, when Resident Evil 7 launched as well, very well received. Once again, like I said, one of the best survival horror games that was out there, and it just felt like you were once again trapped in a big mansion where you had to survive against some sort of biohazard thing that kind of resembled the whole zombies in the first place. But most importantly, this game was no longer really tied down to a lot of the previous history that got super convoluted, so many characters to pay attention to, so many different secret organizations going on. This one was just a guy looking for his wife and gets into this hillbilly horror-esque scenario trying to figure everything out. Ultimately, what it did was hit a soft reset button on all of the lore up into this point, because the story was very much individual, but then started to pull on some of the previous elements from the franchise without making them essential to know, so that players could just kind of hop into this one and it was a fresh experience and you would figure things out as you just went through the entire game. And you know what? People loved it. It sold extremely well, and players were suddenly revitalized about Resident Evil. So many more people were so confident about the series after RE7 came out, where it almost wiped away the whole doubt that Resident Evil 6 had really created for the franchise. But of course, it doesn't stop there. We have to talk about the rest of Capcom as well, because since Resident Evil 7 sold so well, I think Capcom started to pick up a couple of lessons from this game and applied it to many of their other franchises that we're kind of seeing going on right now. And so when we talk about the mainline Capcom franchises, we've got the Resident Evil games, that should be very much apparent right now, Monster Hunter, Devil May Cry, Ace Attorney, Street Fighter, and Mega Man. And if we think about a lot of these series that currently exist, with Mega Man being the exception, a lot of them have pretty large games that have released in the recent past that kind of follow the exact same thing that RE7 did for the Resident Evil franchise. I think the clearest example of this is actually Monster Hunter World, where if you knew about the Monster Hunter franchise before, because there are so many darn games, it was really intimidating to get into. I remember as a kid, I tried to pick up one of the Monster Hunter games and it was just simply too confusing for me to wrap my head around, and everything felt so like finicky, and it was just a really tough time to get in. Oh my god, Monster Hunter people are going to be very upset with me with what I'm saying about the previous franchise. But then Monster Hunter World came out, and this is the first game that I could just sit down and play, and I understood all of it. It looked very pretty. Very similar to Resident Evil 7, it revitalized the series, made a very easy entry point for new gamers to come into and enjoy the game as is. And so, just to put this in a little bit of chronological order, we had Monster Hunter World in 2018, a year after Resident Evil 7. Then Devil May Cry 5 came out in 2019, where instead of trying to revitalize the story in any sort of direction, they just turned it into this stupid action game, throw all the characters together, and change, make the combat so crazy and cutscenes all over the place. Wow, it was like a new version of Devil May Cry that was very well liked. The Great Ace Attorney Chronicles comes out in 2021, where, the Phoenix Wright series had become very bloated with the whole Ace Attorney thing. Similarly, because they're visual novels, you had to consistently pile onto these characters more and more and more stuff. And then the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles was just like, let's just throw it back in time to like the ye old days and then do things there, where it's a separated story. Could be kind of linked to the Phoenix Wright franchise, but more or less is new. And then last but not least, Street Fighter 6 came out in 2023. If you look at Street Fighter and how everything was building, this is definitely the one where you can be like, okay, I can just kind of pick this up. The story mode is really goofy. The character creation is really goofy, but there's so much new stuff that even if I didn't play any of the previous fighting games, I can kind of hop on board here and figure out what's going on. None of that previous Street Fighter stuff is going to prevent me from playing Street Fighter 6. All these games reimagine their predecessors to some effect, but ultimately serve as great entry points into the franchise without bringing all of the bulk from the previous games in the franchise. I mean, when you think about some of these series, there's like 20 years of history on catching up, and like I said, Capcom's strategy was to build upon what the previous game done, and it can get very convoluted very quickly. Like if I'm coming into a new Ace Attorney game and I don't know any of the previous stuff about Apollo Justice or Phoenix Wright or Miles Edgeworth, any of that type of stuff, I'm going to be extremely confused hopping into Dual Destinies, and quite frankly, I might actually just take a step back and be like, oh, maybe that one's not for me. But by really creating these new entry points into the franchises, this is a much easier time for so many more people to be able to get into these games, and it works out extremely well for Capcom to bolster their sales. But then there's the other part of their strategy, which is to reimagine their previous games, to re-release those to capture those nostalgic moments from the other gamers. And once again, going back to our prime example of Resident Evil, we see the Resident Evil 2 remake come out, where they took the old games and reimagined them and reprocessed them to make this brand new game, which captures the nostalgic factor. All those people who played that as a kid are going to be like, oh my goodness, I needed to hop back into this one because this looks sick. Actually, fun fact, playing the Resident Evil 2 remake unlocked like a core memory of when I was like a wee little child. My cousin brought the original PlayStation over to my grandma's house during one of our family events and played the opening of Resident Evil 2, and I was so terrified about it that I think I mentally repressed it until I saw the cutscene in the RE2 remake, and then I was like, oh my god, PTSD. But like I said, Capcom are remaking these games with pretty good quality. Obviously the Resident Evil franchise, RE4 was the most recent one that also came out, where it's a full remake of RE4, and next up is going to be Dead Rising, which should just be on the horizon. Something about Capcom really reimagining and remaking these zombie games feels like that's kind of their bread and butter. And then to really capture the nostalgic factor, they're re-releasing a lot of collections of classic games in bundles that are relatively cheap to once again capture those nostalgic gamers to really just buy into these franchises yet again. I know Mega Man hasn't really gotten a lot of love in this current day and age, but there's so many different Mega Man collections that are being released on like Nintendo Switch and PC. I'm seeing Mega Man X come back, and that's like, oh my god, I haven't seen Mega Man X since, once again, I was a child. So many of these games were around when I was a child. There's 20 years of history going on for a lot of these franchises, and so they're picking and choosing some of these old games and then just using nostalgia to continue to bolster their sales alongside these whole new entry points that are being done to the mainline franchises. Quite frankly, this is brilliant because not only are you securing all of the new gamers that want to come into this, but you're also providing, the nostalgic gamers, but also too, hey, these new gamers, if you really like this game, maybe you should check out some of the previous games. It's a lot more accessible for you and a little bit cheaper for you to go in and try out. It's a mix of these new entry points and game collections or remasters that is really sustaining them and just renewing so much interest from the public. But then the age-old question of what is going to come next. And it really is hard to predict where this is going to go, because these new, we're going to call it the second generation of these games, are starting to grow more and more and more and more, coming into that same issue where they felt like they had to keep on adding things onto the previous games. Case in point, look at Resident Evil 7 to Resident Evil 8. There was a massive change in how the game really operated too. Resident Evil 8 was a lot more of an action shootery game, more in line with like Resident Evil 4 than RE7. And I'm not necessarily saying that this is a bad thing by any means, because I think Resident Evil 8 was a fantastic game, but then you have to wonder, are they gonna get back into the same rabbit hole of making these franchises so convoluted and so built upon previous generations that people are gonna feel alienated from trying the new releases anymore? But at the same time, I do have confidence that, you know, maybe freshening up their IP or changing up some of the fresh ideas, there's something there, and it's working right now, but it's going to reach a critical mass where hopefully Capcom will be a little bit more sustainable in the future as these franchises continue to evolve. And so the future will tell, but right now, I mean, it's very clear Capcom is one of the highest grossing game developers in this modern era, and it feels like they just release bangers after bangers after bangers. We'll see if that trend continues as time continues to go on. But that about wraps up this video. And you know what? I want to hear from you. What was your favorite Capcom franchise? Which was the new game that they've recently released that either brought you back in or was a genuine surprise? Because once again, for me, I told that anecdote earlier, but Monster Hunter World, genuine surprise at how much I actually enjoyed the game. But that just about wraps it up. Thank you to Resident Evil 7 for bringing all of these crazy Capcom games back into our life, because I think that it was a huge lesson that Capcom learned from. They took a risk with the Resident Evil franchise and it worked out perfectly for them. So big shout out to that game. Alrighty, thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe if you did. I'm going to be posting more of these editorial videos. I hope you kind of like learning a little bit more about the history, and let me know in the comments if this is the type of content that you would like to see. But okay, I'm releasing this in October because it's spooky season, Resident Evil 7, so stay tuned. I've got a couple more spooky videos coming out. Should be a good time. All right, bye everyone. Catch you in the next video.